Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome to St. Paul's Letters to America. I was going to say this is another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America, but in a way it's a first. So I am your host for this program. I'm Ray Gerard. This is my co-host, Bob Hennekeys.
Howdy.
Bob, thanks for being here with us again today.
Good to be with you, Ray.
Bob and I have been doing podcasts, but today we're moving for a while now, about a year. But now we're moving up in the world, so we're going to be doing video as well as the audio. So yes, we are graduating.
Yeah, and that's not because it's more appropriate for us to be on video. We probably ought to wear masks or something.
Probably better on the just on the radio. But anyway, so this is St. Paul's Letters to America, and this is a program where we ask, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if instead of writing a letter to the Ephesians or the Galatians or the Romans, he could write a letter to Americans? If he were alive today, what would he tell us? Well, strangely enough, we have the pretentiousness to think that we know what he would tell us. And so we start our programs with just such a letter. And then we use that letter to look at an issue that is current in our society today. And we compare those issues to what St. Paul tells us. We compare how we are acting, how we are responding to those issues with what St. Paul would tell us. Because if St. Paul, like all the writers of the books of the Bible, were inspired, then they were expressing truths that are timeless. They're not just for a certain age or a certain period or a certain place, but they're true everywhere and at all times. And if that's the case, then we can sincerely benefit by looking at issues in our culture today through the prism of the letters of St. Paul. Today, for a letter, we have this. There is neither slave nor free person. There is not male and female. There is neither born nor unborn. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendant, heirs according to the promise. Now, if you are familiar with St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, you may notice that there was a line in there that was been inserted that wasn't in the original. There is neither born nor unborn. St. Paul didn't actually say that. But that, however, is a suggestion, an interpretation, a supposition that is not mine. That insertion is based on a supposition that is not mine, but is one that comes from Father Frank Pavone. He is the National Director of Priests for Life. And it's his thought that if St. Paul were alive today, he would put that in there. And why? Because it's perfectly consistent with everything else St. Paul taught and said. I mean, he taught and said that all of us are equal, whether you're a slave or you're free. I mean, that was a radical idea at the time. I mean, at that point in time, slavery was not only commonplace, but it was rational. You needed it. It was just the division of labor. You needed it in order to be able to supply the needs of, the cities and the societies that they had at the time. But yet he came out and said, whether you're a slave or whether you're not, you're equal, at least in the sight of God.
Which nobody else would be saying at that point in time. There was certainly a difference between slave and not. And the folks that were in the slave institution certainly understood that and knew that. Their world was very, very different. And so they were a different class of people as far as they were concerned. And St. Paul called that out and said, no, you're not. You are all loved by God. It is not the case. So very radical.
Because he wasn't thinking, in human terms. He wasn't thinking the way, that he would think as a Roman citizen or as a property owner if he owned property. No, he was thinking as a servant of the gospel, the truth.
As divine truth.
Now we can ask, would St. Paul actually say that? Would that be consistent with what St. Paul believed? I mean, is Father Pavone right in suggesting this? And the fact is that in that same letter to the Galatians, from which we quoted earlier, he also said this: when God, who from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through grace. God called him in his mother's womb. Now, that's not possible unless you're a person, unless you're created by God, unless God had it in his mind to create you before you were conceived. There are multiple places in the Bible. Jeremiah is a famous one, where he talks about, God knew me before I was born.
Right.
I think we're on solid ground saying if St. Paul were alive today, he would say this: born or unborn, all are equal.
Well, I think in the scriptures, one of the places I always think of is when Mary goes ahead to visit her cousin Elizabeth and goes up to the hill country. And as soon as she walks in the door, right, Mary or Elizabeth greets her and says that her baby, John the Baptist, leapt with joy inside of her by the voice of the carrier of our Lord.
He was cramped in there. He's stretching his legs.
So if ever there's lots of places, I think, in the scriptures that'll actually call out and tell us, yes, you are alive, you are well, and you are very much a person in the womb and someone to be taken care of and protected by God.
Even my daughter will tell me, it's like there are lots of mothers that will have stories about, a child when they're in the room, and you play a certain music for them all the time, play a certain song for them all the time, and then after they're born, they smile when that song comes out, or some kind of story like that. My daughter tells me that about my granddaughter. There's a lot of evidence for this. So, if that is in fact what St. Paul has to tell us, that whether you're born or unborn, you're equal. You are equal. How does that affect or couch how we should, respond to or speak about this issue of abortion today? Well, let's just take a look at some of the things that are happening recently. Abortion is a topic we've talked about before, but as we're doing this particular program, we're doing it, contemporaneously with the 47th March for Life in Washington, D.C., and so it's appropriate that we talk about this issue again. And there's always things in the news dealing with this. For example, just recently, there was a sit-in at the office of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. And so what happened was a lot of people basically sat in her office. They were protesting a certain action of hers. And actually the police ended up getting called. They got ushered out of the office. I think 9 people were actually arrested because they didn't leave some place. I don't know exactly, but anyways, they caused I guess some discomfort with the people who were working in Ms. Pelosi's office. She wasn't there. I guess she was out of the country. But in any event, they felt it incumbent upon them, and they felt that it was important enough to go and actually do this. Well, why? Because, and this is what they were protesting, there is a law that has been proposed in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate called the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. Not just the title alone should give you. Yeah, right? It should give you a clue. You're an abortion subject. You survive. You're born alive, and we have to pass a law. We have to pass a law to actually protect you. What are we thinking? Why would that even be necessary?
I had no idea until New York came out with this abortion law not too long ago, and I didn't even realize that if somebody survived an abortion, that they weren't protected and would then go on with their life, and they're not. I was sort of blown away by that. I guess I just figured once they were breathing and surviving outside the womb, they would be protected, but evidently that's not the case. I just didn't understand that.
Yeah, you would think normal human kindness, if nothing else, would be enough for people to step in and protect that child.
You bet.
Those comments by Governor Northam down in Virginia was about a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
Where there was a bill that was up for consideration in Virginia, and there was a proponent of the bill who was testifying before the Virginia legislature, and she was asked, well, does your law permit somebody to have an abortion right up until the last minute of the pregnancy? What if somebody was like going into labor? They were at the very end of the pregnancy. They were actually physically really going into labor. Could the mother hold up her hand at that point and say, stop, let's abort the child? And the proponent of the bill, tried to evade the question, but eventually she conceded and said, yeah, it would allow for that. So the next day, the governor of Virginia was on a radio program, and he was asked about this. And he said, people need to calm down. This is not such a big thing. Look, this would all be handled, very calmly, very professionally. He said, look, nothing would happen that immediate instant to the baby. The baby would be born. It would be taken care of. It would be fine. And then, when a calmer climate prevailed, the doctor and the mother would have a discussion. Well, that sounds nice. Except for the fact is, what would they be discussing?
It's an execution discussion, right?
Yes.
So that caused imagine.
So that caused a lot of, needless to say, that caused a lot of furor. But then what? Is he just a solitary, isolated figure and nobody thinks like him? Or maybe it was just a slip of the tongue. Maybe that's all it was, slip of the tongue. Okay, so then you wouldn't probably need a Born Alive Protection Act, but if you did, you would certainly get it passed. No.
You would think.
No.
You would think.
No.
Any reasonable person would think.
So what these people are protesting is the fact that the Speaker of the House and her colleagues have prevented even a vote on that bill more than 80 times. Apparently, I think you need 218 votes in order to adopt what's called a discharge petition, which would then require a vote to be taken on the law. And they needed 21 Democrats to go along with this petition, and they couldn't get it. They got 3 Democrats, but they fell short. So you've got over 200 members of the Democratic Party in the House. All you need is 10% of them. They couldn't get it. So Governor Northam is not some isolated individual. His comments were not just simply a mere slip of the tongue. If you think it's maybe just the House of Representatives, you'd be mistaken. Same situation prevails in the U.S. Senate. They need 60 votes in order to allow a vote there. They're only able to get 53. So, you've got 47 members of the Senate. You've got over 200 members of the U.S. Congress who will not allow a vote on a law that will protect a child after it's born.
And the 60 votes in the Senate, that's because the Republicans have the majority, but they don't have enough to stop a filibuster. So the Democratic side could filibuster and keep that from happening.
My understanding is, there's that filibuster rule. My understanding is, you need 60. If you're going to get, a bill to be voted on, that's what you need.
Wow.
So anyways, So what we have is a situation where, and you mentioned it, there's a New York law that specifically provides that, no, you do not have to care for a child. And there are horror stories that I've heard about, children crying and screaming and, nobody does anything for them for an hour or two until they expire. I mean, horrific stories that nobody ever wants to talk about.
Yeah, they'd just be unconscionable. I can't imagine being there and hearing that as a trained professional in the medical industry and not somehow wanting to reach out, right? Being very naive, I would think the Hippocratic Oath would almost force you to grab that child and protect it. I can't even imagine that.
Yeah. So what we have is a situation where the law treats certain people differently.
You bet.
So now Father, Pavone's suggestion, the born and the unborn, we should change to the born and the, although attempted to be unborn, yet somehow born anyway. I mean, you've got Born and born, treated differently under our law.
Yeah, that's amazing.
You know, so you know, also on the just to I guess keep reviewing a few current events. For example, in New York, you mentioned the New York law that was passed. Well, at the same time, the New York passed it's what they called the Reproductive Health Act. They also passed what they call the Comprehensive Contraception Coverage Act, which requires health insurers to provide abortifacient drugs. But beyond that, they also, at the same time, they also passed another law that perhaps I didn't hear about. And they're called the Boss Bills. And what they do is they require people who support abortion to be treated as a protected class for employment purposes. So in other words, if you believe abortion is right, if you believe it is a right, you are a protected class for employment purposes. So in other words, if you are an employer and you want to fire somebody because they're pro-choice, you can't do that. That's illegal. Well, now, who would necessarily want to do that? I would think most employers wouldn't necessarily even ask people about those personal,
Typically don't think about that.
Yeah. So who would be most likely to think that that kind of a position is important? Well, religious organizations.
Yeah.
One of them is called the Evergreen Association, Inc., and it's a charitable organization that operates maternal health and pregnancy centers. And the leader of that organization said, this is a problem for us because, we counsel, pro-life, theories and thinking. And if I got to hire somebody whose views are entirely, opposed to that, they're not going to fill our company's purpose. I mean, they're going to go against, I'm going to have to hire somebody and pay somebody to go against what we believe and, what we're working for. Why is that in America where supposedly there is freedom of religion? But nonetheless, under the New York law, that's the situation they face. So the Thomas More Society has brought a lawsuit against them, and now they're fighting in court over that.
So what happens, Ray, if on the opposite side, if you are, say, someone who is against abortion, are you a protected class as well? Do we have both halves of that covered, or is it just one direction?
I'm not aware of a law that says the opposite. So they, and the law, apparently doesn't say, like, whatever your views on abortion are, the way it's reported. And I make it a practice of checking each law specifically. The Born Alive Protection Act, I did. I read the statute. This one, I didn't. But the way it's been reported is the people who support abortion are a protected class.
Wow.
So, then there's another event that recently happened. This was in the United Kingdom. At the University of Nottingham, they have a school for midwives. And there was a 24-year-old student in that program called Julia Rinkowitz. And one of the school officials saw her attending a booth at a school fair. Well, Ms. Winkowitz is the president of the Nottingham Students for Life. And the booth that she was hosting at the school fair was for that organization. Like within days after that school fair, she received a letter that notified her of a formal complaint being brought against her, because among other things, she expressed personal beliefs regarding reproductive sexual health. So she's in trouble because she expressed her personal beliefs. Now she said that, being pro-life isn't exactly incompatible with being a midwife.
Sort of fits together.
It sort of fits
most of the time, right?
It sort of fits together. And she said that, universities should be a place where debate is not only allowed, but is encouraged. Nonetheless, a complaint was brought against her, and for a year, she was prevented from continuing her studies. The university just recently reversed that decision, so we've got a good result here. But the fact is, she was held up for a year.
So a woman who is trying to support other women through the birth process believes in the right to life, and she gets her studies suspended for over or close to a year for not bringing that up even in the school, for living that way in the rest of her life at a school fair, and she's stopped from continuing her studies.
And I think, I don't know, but I would suspect, now we can be careful when we, speculate on things. But, the report that I found said that, the university reversed its decision. So no doubt there are some people, you would think it likely that some people were in favor of that reversal, some people not. So I think it's fair to perhaps speculate that some people that don't think the school should have reversed it. And if not only would she have been suspended for a year, but her studies would have been discontinued and her not to be allowed to be a midwife at all. So, again, that's speculation, but it seems It seems a reasonable, way to look at that. Now, with things like that going on, the Born Alive Protection Act being thwarted, 80 attempts to get a vote, just to get a vote, and you can't have it. New York saying you have to believe a certain way in order to avoid a employment discrimination claim. That's really what it is.
Right.
This New York law is basically legislating opinions, ideas. Now we're into thought laws, thought regulation.
Thought control.
So anyways, if you think, all that's kind of bad, there are some people fighting back. Now, Indiana apparently decided to be very, outward in their attitudes. At least one Indiana legislator, he proposed a law which says, and I quote, "The courts of the United States have no jurisdiction to interfere with Indiana's interest in protecting human physical life from the moment human physical life begins. It is unlawful for any official, agent, or employee of the United States government or an employee of a private entity providing services to the United States government to enforce any act, law, treaty, order, rule, or regulation of the United States government that interferes with Indiana's interest in protecting human physical life from the moment that human physical life begins." Now, we had a civil war in this country, cost a few lives, over 500,000. But we had a civil war. Essentially, a lot of people think it was over slavery, and it was, but it was as much or more so over states' rights. Slaveholding states thought that they had the right, to make their own laws, to subjugate, a certain whole group of people and commit them to lives of misery simply because, their skin color was different. Not exactly what St. Paul talked about.
Right.
But they believed the states had the right to make those laws. Well, now we've got the federal government coming in and saying, that, you have the right to kill the unborn. And in some cases, if you can't protect the unborn that become born, well, then you're not protecting the born either. You've got federal law that, because it won't say the negative, positively says, or at least sanctions, implicitly sanctions infanticide. Some states don't agree with it. Some states say they have the right to say otherwise. That's because these states obviously feel this is so important. And the comparisons have been made that this whole, pro-life movement is a lot like the abolition movement.
Yeah.
You are fighting for the rights of the oppressed.
You bet.
And so people are we are ratcheting up tensions and feelings in this country now to the point where you got somebody at least, proposing a law in Indiana that would tell the federal government to just get out. So that's interesting.
That would be completely the opposite of Roe v. Wade that happened in 73, January of 73.
73.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because Roe v. Wade said that it was a federal constitutional right. They found it implied in the Constitution that there was a right to privacy that included, abortions in certain circumstances, and there have been a lot of cases since then interpreting what those circumstances are. But yeah, they essentially took the decision out of the hands of the states. So this whole, it's funny. I I was at,
It's falling down here.
oh, yes, having technical difficulties.
There we go.
But I was outside the abortion clinic here in St. Louis yesterday, doing sidewalk counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And my partner doing it with me was a young woman who immigrated here from Algeria.
Mm-hmm.
And, no, excuse me, Liberia.
Okay.
And so she said, it's strange, this whole abortion thing. She didn't know about it until, her family moved here. That, for them, it wasn't an issue. You don't do this. So why, so I guess that, she became animated enough that now she's, doing something, in her way to try to, protect the unborn. But, in other cultures, this is just unheard of.
Yeah, for myself, I think many of these things come down to the set of circumstances we're in. And for me, I'd just like to share a couple things. As you know, I am a adopted parent. So I have actually we adopted 3 children, and I was the guardian for a 4th. So my ex-wife and I were not able to conceive, and we adopted children. And this issue is huge for me, because the only way I was going to become a father is if some woman that was pregnant was going to give up her baby. And many of the times we talk about abortion, the real difficult part of the conversation comes when you talk about rape or incest. Mm-hmm. Most people line up and will say, abortion may be bad, but if it's rape or incest, you don't want to force the woman to carry that baby that extra length of time. Well, one of the young ladies that gave up her child to me as a father was involved in a date rape. And the child that came from that, my son, right, could well have been aborted, could have chose to do that. But this young lady, very young, 19 years old, decided to take this on. And every day for 9 months, she knew that she was going to deliver a baby that was the product of a rape. And I can only imagine the courage that was required to make it through that. And then what I can tell you is I can only imagine the joy that she brought to me. It was a gift from God that she was able to bring and make it through that. And my son's a wonderful guy. He lives in Colorado, graduated from Arizona, and is now working in industry and really enjoys life. And I cannot imagine what the world would be like without him. And this young lady actually put up with that pain, that difficulty, and went through this so that my son could be born. A wonderful act that for an adopted father requires some sort of act like that for a woman to accept that. And I am nothing but overwhelmingly thankful and loving towards Jenny and towards what she's done for me and allowing me to be a father. And I wish I could encourage more people that they could hear that not only can this be done, it has been done, and the joy and the desire of people around the world that cannot have children is such that these children would be accepted because they are wonderful. They are a gift from God, and certainly in need of being adopted and taken care of. And all of my children, anyone you talk to, Ray, that has an adoption story, talks about the individual that lovingly took care of them. And for me, that was 3 different women that allowed me to become a father, because that was not going to happen medically, but they were able to give me that opportunity to allow me to love, care for, teach, nurture children. And it's a wonderful experience for which I am very, very thankful. And to legislate things that children would be killed after they're born just tears me apart. It rips me up. to think about doing those kind of things?
What you talk, before, we sat down to record this program, we were talking about St. Paul and his views on Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Mm-hmm. And, the turmoil, the torture, the horror that he went through. Here's a woman who gave you your son. Yeah. Who went through a torturous ordeal.
Absolutely. I feel for her, right?
And so if she was following Christ, she was making a tremendous sacrifice in order to follow the example, set by Christ. And, obviously, so how do we want our society to be organized? Do we want to adopt precepts and principles and ways of living that are based on the example of Christ or something else? It was, these arguments that get put forth to support abortion. You mentioned one of them. We want to set rules for society as a whole based on an egregious case, like where somebody is the victim of rape. And you just brought us a beautiful story of someone, in that kind of a circumstance. And yet there's beauty that comes out of it. But that's not the only argument, that gets put forth in support of basically, it's taking of the most defenseless human life. There's another one, it's the woman's body. It's, that's what it's all about. And Kristen Hawkins, somebody who, she's the director for Students for Life. Mm-hmm. Someone who we interviewed on a prior, program in this series. But, she was commenting about this fact that we can't pass this law. We can't even get a vote on this law to protect the born. And she said, it is inhumane to stand by and allow babies born during botched abortions to be treated as trash. This is not a life of the mother, health of the mother situation either, as the infant lies alone and in need of care. That is one of the other arguments that, you need to have, abortions in order to protect the life of the mother, to protect the health of the mother. Well, here you've got a baby that's born. Where is that served at all in that circumstance?
Right.
It's not. It's not.
Yep.
I don't know. I'm familiar with the arguments that people use to support abortion. What is the argument to support after a baby is born alive, it does not need to be protected? What argument could there be?
I can't imagine.
What interest of the mother is there at that point? The other, very common argument is, it's the mother's right to choose because it's the mother's body. Okay, now it's out of the mother's body. It's a living person, all by itself.
Yeah, it's no longer a part of that woman. And I know for you and I, we believe while the fetus is in the womb, it is a person. It's certainly being nurtured in her body.
If you believe St. Paul, if you believe Jeremiah, if you believe in a God that knows all things, that would know people inside, outside of the room, you've got a baby that's 8.5 months developed. It's certainly at that point it's certainly viable.
You bet.
God doesn't know that person. God does. If you believe in the soul, okay. So when does a person have a soul? It doesn't have a soul maybe 8.5 months, but it has a soul 2 weeks later.
I think St. John the Baptist actually had a soul when he leapt in Elizabeth's womb when Mary showed up and his Savior showed up, right, when she came to visit. There's no doubt that they have souls. If you've ever seen a fetus, it sucks its thumb, it moves, it feels pain, right? The sensors in its brain, its heart is beating. The definition of when someone dies, their heart stopping, right? That's the definition of when someone dies. You could also have a brain death, but typically it's a heart. the heart starts beating in a very short order.
It's like 13 days.
Yeah, it's ridiculously young. Those same measures that we use to believe in life are completely twisted around and turned, and so difficult and hard to understand.
You know, there's a new poll out done by the Marist group, if I can find it. And it's interesting because 65% of registered voters say they are more likely to vote for candidates who want to limit abortion to at most the first 3 months of pregnancy. So 65% of the American population, or 65% of registered voters, more likely to vote for candidates who would limit abortion to the first 3 months, the first trimester, not even the second trimester. Most of the regulations in this country that restrict abortions, they work around this like 22, 23, 24 week of pregnancy timeline. Now, some of them will go all the way, like the recent laws in New York will go all the way up to the end, but most of them are on this 20, 22, 23, 24 week. It's that second trimester.
Yeah, that's halfway through.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I had a daughter born at 23 weeks, and she was a fighter. She's been a fighter all her life. And I have no doubt. I mean, she had a demeanor and an attitude before she was born. She was fighting before she was born. She fought because there were a lot of complications. She was born at 23 weeks. The last several weeks before she was born, there were lots of complications. The doctors told us, she had stopped growing. She wasn't getting sufficient fluid anymore. All this stuff. And actually, they counseled us to have an abortion in not direct terms, but in gentle, sort of suggestive ways. They were saying, you'd be fine if you decided to do this, or it'd be understandable, reasonable if you decided to do this, something along those lines. But I swear she had a demeanor before she was born, and it continued after. So, yeah, of course. This is, this is not strange to think this way. That that people look. If you have an individual kind of a personality, if you have something that makes you different from somebody else, if you have a soul, if you have some core to your being, it doesn't just pop up, the day after you're born. But anyway, so 65%, going back to the poll.
Which is a huge number. And
65%, yeah.
Put that together, Ray, which is hard to imagine. 65%, two-thirds, close to two-thirds of the United States, believes it should be held to that reign. Mm-hmm. Yet we can't even get a vote in the House or the Senate
right.
to save those that have already been born. How is that because they work that way?
Yeah, because we're not listening to the people, right? We're not that So, but another result of this study, and by the way, that 65% factor is not just an isolated thing. It matched the Marists in conjunction with NPR did a poll the year before and got similar results. I think it was like around 70%, 65%, same kind of results the year before. Also, but anyway, in this most recent poll, 45 to 35% of people who say they're pro-life say that this abortion issue is going to be a major factor in their vote for president. Okay? Well, the people who identify as pro-life versus pro-choice are now 55 to 40. The year before it was 57 to 35, but so it's growing from 35 to 40. There's so anyways, over the span of a year now, the pro-life people are kind of catching up, but it's still 55 to 40. Still, the majority of people are pro-choice, giving people the right to choose. That sounds good. So, but anyways, if we put those two together, what you're left with is, okay, so if 40% of the population, and like I said, the number is coming up, 40% of that population does identify as pro-life, and 45 to 35, let's take the middle, say 40%, 40% of them say that abortion will be a major factor in their choice for president. What you've got now is like 1 in 5 people in this country who are going to vote. 1 in 5 thinking abortion as a major issue in their choice for president. Yeah, I think people have a sense that the times are changing. We've had abortion for 47 years. And I think maybe it's the gravity and the intensity of these laws that are being passed. You mentioned the one in New York.
It was just
I think
egregious.
people are pulling back from this.
Right.
They're saying, wait a minute. That's why you've got states like Indiana coming up and saying, hey, we don't care what the federal government says. When abortion was first made legal in this country, the idea was to make it safe and rare, and it's not becoming, it's not, in a lot of ways, it's not safe and rare, and if you are actually taking positions that are in favor of letting babies die who are born, I mean, you don't believe, safety for whom?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's nuts. It really is. I mean, I don't think there's another word that you can use, but that it's nuts. Yeah, the baby is alive.
Yeah, for myself, you go the next step. Think of all of those kids that could be here today that were aborted. As a school teacher, as a high school teacher for St. Dominic, I think that while the halls are a little crowded, I sure wish they were a little more crowded with all the children that have died over the last 50 years because of this law. They have been taken away. And to me, not surprisingly, I believe that every one of them is a child of God from the moment of conception. And those children were wiped out by this law. Millions and millions and millions of children that we have killed over the last 50 years could be walking the halls of any high school around, and yet they were never given that chance. It just seems like we're missing the boat. It almost seems like we're in some sort of genocide where we're taking people out. And not very many people I know think of someone like Hitler as a good guy and believing good rules, yet he was doing that. The only difference was he was doing that to people after their birth. Jewish people. He was doing it to folks that didn't believe his way, gypsies, right? And yet we are killing those simply on the other side of the birth canal. And just seems unbelievable to me that we can continue to do that. And I love the fact that we truly think maybe something is rising. Maybe it's the right time. And maybe, which is most important, God is calling us to try to change this whole mess and calling us to do what he wishes and what he desires, which are to save and protect these kids.
If you were to say what you just said, 30 years ago, you'd be branded some kind of nut job, radical. To talk about genocide, in this context, painting the people who support abortion as, perpetrators of some kind of genocide, you'd be, roundly ostracized for even suggesting that these people would be motivated by, such hateful kind of thinking. And I don't want to say that people that support abortion are hateful or subscribe to hateful thinking, but what they support, is a hateful kind of behavior. It's hateful kind of activity. To say, okay, hey, this is a genocide of a sort, and think that's crazy. Well, it's not crazy to say that, because here we've got a law that says, look, if you are born, we shouldn't kill you, or shouldn't let you die, which is the same. Effectively, It's the same thing.
Correct.
When that a baby needs care in order to survive, and you deliberately refuse to offer the care which is within your capability to give, what are you doing if it's not killing that child? To talk in terms of genocide would have been branded as ridiculous, and yet here we are. It's not about killing. No, it's about a mother's right to choose. It's not about killing. Well, now it is. Now it is. Now it is.
Right.
Now it is. I don't know. I mean, it's I don't know where some of this is going or where it's going to go. But I agree with you that this is. I think you said this is going to change. I think it's going to change. I think it's got to change.
I hope so. I hope and pray.
I mean, the truth has got to win out. I mean, you were talking about all these kids that are not there. I've heard stories like some young children, like many who participated in the March for Life. They'll think to themselves things that you and I never had to think about. Like, they'll look to, like, I've heard stories where they'll look to like people in their classrooms on the right and the left and think, okay, well, one out of a group of 4 or 5, would be here but is not.
Disappeared.
I mean, to think that one out of every 5 kids in your classroom, there's one person out of every 5 in your classroom or every 4 that's missing.
Right.
I mean, if you're part of that generation, I mean, doesn't that, like in some sense, like doesn't the idea like fall on you? Well, what if it was me? What if I was the one who was missing? I mean, that's a shattering kind of a thought.
Absolutely.
And yet we're subjecting our kids to that.
Absolutely.
We got all this anxiety and stress in kids today, and we're trying to come up with the reasons as to why that is. Maybe because we're shaking their world to the foundation. Like maybe but for it, you wouldn't even exist. It's crazy. Well, if we're going to talk about recent events on this, I suppose we ought to talk about something historic. The President of the United States attended the March for Life recently, and that's the first time that's ever been done.
Yeah, Mike Pence was out there previously,
right?
In previous years of this administration. Yet this year, President Trump actually made it out with the marchers just yesterday, I think, wasn't it?
He made it out there, and he had issued a proclamation prior to that. And part of that proclamation said, I ask every citizen of this great nation to listen to the sound of silence caused by a generation lost to us. That's exactly what we were talking about. And then to raise their voices for all affected by abortion, both seen and unseen. Also said that every person, doesn't this sound like Father Pavone's idea of St. Paul? Trump declared that, quote, every person, the born and unborn, the poor, the downcast, the disabled, the infirm, and the elderly, has inherent value. And the U.S. proudly and strongly reaffirms our commitment to protect the precious gift of life at every stage, from conception to natural death. The born and the unborn has inherent value. If St. Paul were alive today, would he agree with that? I mean, how would he not? How would he not? I mean, Paul was a scholar of the Old Testament. I think the Old Testament, begins, man was created in God's image.
You bet.
So, we have a president who came to the March for Life and said that. I mean, why? Why now? We're speculating about, hey, things may be changing. Things may be reaching a point where people are looking around at these events, some of them that we've talked about, some of these laws that are being passed, and saying, wait a minute, things are going a little too far. And maybe that's why, a president has the courage for the first time to come out publicly and boldly, do something that no other president has ever done. And, I mean, this is not something that should be cast in political terms. I don't care what political party you're in. I mean, we're talking about Republicans and Democrats simply because these are the positions that they've taken for themselves.
Right.
But when you're talking about the protection of the unborn, I mean, this should not be political. This should be. I mean, this is a human issue. This is the difference between being humane and unhumane. I don't understand. I don't understand. Why it really can't be seen that way.
You know, one of the things I used to do with my kids, I love to do, is there's an author by the name of Dr. Seuss. It was one of my favorites. He used words that were rhyming, and they were small and easy to understand for a young child, and I used to love to read various books. The Grinch That Stole Christmas at Christmas time, and Go Dog Go, and many others. But there was one about Horton Hears a Who, about this whole group of little people, small people. And I just can't help but think that Dr. Seuss was talking about the unborn. One of the phrases that I've heard is a person no matter how small.
Yeah.
And that was from there. It just seems to me that he was shaking the tree and saying, we don't have the right to be taking this out on someone who's smaller than us. And in fact, isn't that what America is all about? Isn't that what the letter to St. Paul is trying to say? Aren't we a group of people that say it doesn't matter what color you are, or what religion you are, or what sex you are, or it doesn't make any difference in any of those. All that matters is that you are alive, and we want you to come join this country, and we want you to thrive. We want you to do well, and you have the right to believe whatever you want. Yet we're killing children at a clip of, 20% of children that are. It's a phenomenal number. We're doing that to a group of people that never had a chance, that can't fight back, that can't tell us that we're wrong. Just seems crazy to me, and I hope that people can understand that a little bit, that what's going on, it's just so wrong. And it hurts, especially when I know, personally, that there are many folks that want these children, want to take care of them, want to help them foster a life, and these children never get a chance.
I've never heard that before. But what, the interpretations you just gave to that Horton Hears a Who story.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, so you've got a speck of dust, right?
Right, with all the who's on it.
And inside that speck of dust are all these, this whole city, this
whole village,
yeah,
right?
This whole village of all these living beings. So microscopic, literally microscopic people.
Right.
When you talk about a fetus, like the
That's what it is.
like the first day after it's conceived, like how small.
Right.
It's
a cell.
That's a dramatic parallel. If Dr. Seuss was talking about that small of a being,
Right.
Yeah. In this context of life beginning at conception, we're talking about that small of a being.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's a connection.
No, right.
Dr. Seuss,
But it's interesting to think about.
But it certainly read that way to me when I read the book. Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it read. And yes, it is that parallel. It is a small cell that begins to split and grow and be nurtured by the mother, and eventually be born. Not brought life; it's already got life as it starts
Right.
as a cell that grows,
Right.
but then is born and becomes someone that can do something in this country,
Yeah.
like stand up against abortion.
Yeah. Just quickly. So, just another little victory on our side. Supreme Court recently refused to hear a challenge to a Kentucky law that requires abortion doctors to present and describe an ultrasound of an unborn child to a mother seeking an abortion and to play an audio of the baby's heartbeat. So Kentucky passed a law. You have to present an ultrasound and an audio of the baby's heartbeat. It was challenged. The Supreme Court decided to let that law stand. That is going to, I would certainly think, encourage a lot of other states to pass similar laws. I know a lot of states have already passed heartbeat laws. I think 8 states in 2019 alone passed heartbeat laws. So, here you go. I want to take us back to St. Paul.
Great.
We started out with this reading where he says, people are equal. Whether you're male or female. There you go. How many fights and how many court cases have we had about the rights of women? We go back 100 years, the right for women to vote and so on and so forth. Paul predates all that.
By 2,000 years.
By 2,000 years. Okay, so whether you're male or female, whether you're a slave or free, and now, if we're going to interpret him as Father Pavone said, born or unborn. Okay. All are equal. But then beyond that, what does he say? Then you're heirs. Heirs to what? Heirs to being adopted children of God in heaven.
The kingdom of heaven.
Nothing less than that. And that's what we're talking about, allowing these children. Well, these children will share that no matter what. But it's another important truth that's here in Paul's writing. So that's our program. Thank you for joining us. We'll hope you join us again. Until then, blessings.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.